Everyone, this is what your pastor didn't tell you. Today I'm on with Chris Date. We're going to be talking about different views of hell, some you might not have heard of. We're going to talk about what is the biblical view of hell. How are you doing today, Chris Date?
I'm doing really well, and it's a pleasure and honor to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Awesome. All right, can you tell us a little bit about your background?
Yeah, I was not raised in an overtly Christian home. I did find out in my teenage years that my dad identifies as Christian, and then a little bit later, my mom. But it wasn't a part of my upbringing. We didn't go to church or anything like that. And by the time I was a young adolescent, I was an atheist and continued to be an atheist until about 20 or 21 years old, which is now a little over 20 years ago. And very soon after becoming a Christian, I became very passionate about sound biblical exegesis and theology and apologetics, and so I poured a lot of time and effort into studying those things. By the time 2009 or 10 rolled around, I started blogging, and then not long thereafter started podcasting. But I really and I'll back up a second. I'm a software engineer by trade. Ever since I was an adult, I've been a software programmer, a software developer, or engineer. And I continue to do that for a living to this day, but it's not really where my passion is. And what I'd like to be able to do is teach Bible and theology at university or seminary level full time. And so to that end, I began an undergraduate degree in religion at Liberty University in 2014. Graduated with that in 2017, and then began a Master of Arts in Theology at Fuller Theological Seminary. And Fuller has a bit of a reputation for being liberal. I don't think that's deserved. They're very diverse. But the reason I say that is to say I didn't go to Fuller because I share a liberal ethos with them. Quite the opposite. I'm extremely conservative, borderline fundamentalist. But I wanted to get my master's degree somewhere where I would be stretched and challenged. I didn't want to do it in an echo chamber. That's kind of what the undergrad's for. So I graduated from Fuller in 2020 with my Master of Arts, and now hopefully one day will be able to go on to do a PhD in either the Old Testament or in biblical theology. A few more things. I'm an adjunct professor of Bible and theology at Trinity College of the Bible and Theological Seminary, which is the school that Braxton Hunter of Trinity Radio is the president of. I am Reformed. I'm a 6-point Calvinist, if you count theological determinism, as I do. I'm a young earth creationist. I'm a so-called partial preterist. I'm an amillennialist. And I'm an annihilationist, which I suppose is part of the reason I'm here today. There's a lot more I could say. I'm married a little over 20 years, been married, have 4 kids ranging in age from 21 at the oldest all the way down to 9 at the youngest, all 4 of them boys. And I could go on, so I'll stop there.
Awesome. All right. Yeah, and everything, YouTube, podcasts, or website, any of that will be in the description.
Perfect. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. All right. So, can you give us, an overview of what are the most popular views of hell?
Well, instead of answering the question, what are the most popular views, I'll just say what the 3 views are within Christianity. The one that is most popular, the one that most of your viewers or listeners are going to be familiar with, is the doctrine of eternal torment. And according to this view, which also goes by the term traditionalism, not because it's held to for purely traditional reasons, but because it is the historically dominant view since at least the time of Augustine. And according to this view, when the dead are raised, and this is really important in Christianity, we don't believe that when you die you go to your eternal home. You go to some kind of intermediate state if you're conscious after death at all, but then one day all humankind will have been raised physically from the dead. Their bodies will come back up out of the ground. And at that point, all sides of the hell debate agree that those who are in Christ, those who are saved, those who are justified, they will be granted immortality in the physical sense of that word. Their bodies will be immortal and incapable of physically dying. They will live forever physically in the blissful presence of God and the community of his people. But here's where the debate begins, because according to this traditional doctrine of eternal torment, the lost will rise physically immortal as well. And they will go on to live forever in physical bodies, blood pumping, muscles contracting and relaxing, etc., eyes rolling in sockets for all eternity. There's some dispute within this traditional view over whether it's literal fire, whether it's purely psychological and emotional suffering, or whether there's also physical suffering. But the point is, physical life, immortality physically for all eternity in hell. That's the traditional view. So you might call it a view, you might categorize it as unconditional immortality, meaning that there are no conditions which a human being must meet in order to be made immortal upon being raised from the dead. Okay? Now, the second Christian view is universalism. And this is not to say that all forms of universalism are Christian. There are forms of universalism that are just outright pluralism. It doesn't matter what you believe, doesn't matter what you do, everybody goes to heaven, full stop. Okay? That's not Christian. But there are, and also the Unitarian Universalists out there who deny the doctrine of the Trinity, that too is not Christian. But there are Universalist, self-proclaimed evangelical Universalists who I think anyway, and we at Rethinking Hell think, deserves the moniker evangelical. According to this strain of evangelical universalism, the resurrected lost will go to hell, but having been made immortal, which is also the case in the doctrine of eternal torment, both of these are forms of unconditional immortality. The Universalist says that when the resurrected lost are raised immortal, they will go to hell, and they will stay there for as long as it takes for them to bend their knee in saving faith and express saving faith in Jesus Christ, at which point they will be rescued from hell. And eventually everybody, including the demons, according to most Universalists, will be rescued from hell. So the reason I think that deserves to be counted as evangelical is because they're not denying any essential of the faith. It's still salvation by grace through faith alone. It's faith in Christ alone, and so on and so forth. It's just that eventually everybody will exercise that faith in hell and be saved. But again, both universalism and traditionalism or eternal torment are forms of unconditional immortality. There's no conditions a human being has to meet to be made immortal upon being raised from the dead. Now enters my view, the right view. We call our view conditional immortality. That's why I've been emphasizing that phrase unconditional immortality to characterize the other two views. Because we believe that the Bible teaches that only those who meet the condition of being saved, of being in Christ, will be made immortal upon being raised from the dead and go on to live physically forever. The lost will be resurrected as well, but they won't be immortal. They will be mortal, every bit as mortal as you and I are now. And their punishment, their eternal punishment, will be everlasting death. They will be killed or allowed to die, depending upon whether you're thinking God is doing it actively or passively. And if we have, as human beings, non-physical souls that continue to be conscious after the first death, we think that the souls of the lost will be killed and slain and destroyed with their bodies in the second death, making it a complete end to their conscious existence for all eternity. And it's for that reason that it's also called annihilationism. That's how it's more popularly known, at least among its critics. The question is, do you live forever? And if you do, where? The traditionalist says, yes, you will live forever, in either heaven or hell. The Universalist says, yes, you will live forever. It's just if you're not in Christ, you'll live for potentially a very long time in hell before being saved and then living the remainder of eternity in heaven. And then the conditionalist says, no, you may not live forever unless you're in Christ. And if upon being raised from the dead and judged, you're not found in him, then you will not live forever. You will instead die and remain dead forever. So that's the terrain of the debate, the three views that Christians debate when it comes to the doctrine of hell.
Awesome. All right. Yeah, so that was really good. I appreciate that summary. Can you talk about, obviously this is going to be, a very extensive question. Can you talk about what the writers of the Old Testament, how they saw hell?
Well, so that's a really interesting way of putting it. If the question is, what did they say about hell? That there's not a lot of data there. Hell, as we get it from the New Testament, is is something that Jesus uses the word Gehenna for, which is sort of it's a word play on the Valley of the Sons of Hinnom in the Old Testament, which was a valley in which false god worshippers, Baal worshippers, Molech worshippers would sacrifice their children by fire. And what the Old Testament and it's not to say that when Jesus uses the word Gehenna, he's talking about the valley. He's not. What he's doing is he's alluding to that valley and what it was associated with in the minds of his hearers, and saying that's what hell will be like. So if we look in the Old Testament for what the Valley of the Sons of Hinnom was thought to be in an eschatological sense, we don't have much data to work on, but we do have some. In Jeremiah chapter 7, verses 30 and following, Jesus says that, Jeremiah says that God will kill his enemies, and their bodies will be left unburied, exposed, and nobody will be able to frighten away the scavenging beasts and birds that feed upon those corpses. Isaiah chapter 66 doesn't mention the valley by name, but most scholars think it's a reference to it. And there too, God slays his enemies, verses 14, 15, 16, that area in Isaiah 66. And then at the end of Isaiah 66, in verse 24, the text says that the corpses of God's slain enemies will be an abhorrence, it'll be contemptuous or contemptible to all flesh, which is the righteous. So only righteous, saved humanity survives in that scene, and God's enemies are slain, as was the case in Jeremiah 7. And that really, I think, is a good segue into answering what I think is the better question, not to demean the question you asked, but I think the better question is, what did the Old Testament authors conceive of final punishment to be like, or final judgment? Because we do have Daniel 12:2, for example, which says that some will rise to everlasting life, but others will rise to shame and everlasting contempt. And in that language, shame is something that is experienced by the risen wicked, but contempt is how they are viewed by the righteous. It's the only other place that word contempt is used is in that passage, Isaiah 66:24. So again, the picture is some rise to everlasting life, but others rise and don't get everlasting life. Instead, they experience shame, and then they're remembered forever in contempt. And by using a word that is only elsewhere used in Isaiah 66:24, we have good reason to think he's saying the lost will rise, experience shame, die, be slain, be rendered corpses, and be remembered forever as an abhorrence. The Psalms are replete with language indicating that the fate of the wicked, the fate of the lost, is to perish, to die, be destroyed, to vanish like smoke, or to be vanished like a dream does when you no longer remember it, to be like chaff that's blown away by the wind after after weeds are burned up. Malachi, the very end of the Old Testament, envisions the wicked being burned to ash beneath the soles of the feet of the righteous. And on I could go. The point being that, in a nutshell, the Old Testament doesn't really conceive of hell in the fullest sense in which we get it in the New Testament, but it does consistently throughout the Old Testament envision the lost finally dying and never living again, and the righteous rising and thereafter living forever.
Very interesting. Okay. We have the Old Testament and then the New Testament, but there's a time period in between. Can you talk about like when this time period is, who this group of people are or peoples, and do we have any texts from that time period that might possibly talk about the topic of hell?
Yeah, so you're talking about what's known as the Intertestamental period, and that period is going to be of different lengths depending upon how quote-unquote conservative you are in your bibliology. So as a very extreme conservative, for example, I think that the book of Daniel was written by by the prophet after whom it is named, that Daniel wrote it, which would place it in like the 6th century BC, something like that. And this view would make the intertestamental period something like 300 or 400 years between the close of the Old Testament canon and the beginning of the New Testament. But there are a lot of Old Testament scholars, including semi-conservative ones, who would say that Daniel is pseudonymous. That is to say, it's written by somebody who's not Daniel, but attributing it to Daniel, and that and they think that it was written in the 2nd century BC, like 150 roughly BC. And if that's one's view, then, you've got a more compressed window of time for the intertestamental period. But the point is, it's the time between the close of the Old Testament and the start of the New. And when we talk about intertestamental literature, we're primarily concerned with Jewish literature. And there's a variety of Jewish books out there that are cited in this debate. But there's not a whole lot of material to go on, at least not that I'm familiar with, but there is some. And that data that we have from that intertestamental Jewish body of literature is mixed. We don't see universalism in that body of literature, which is one of many reasons why I think universalism ought to be rejected by Christians. But what we do find is some examples of the doctrine of eternal torment. So, for example, the book of Judith in the Roman Catholic canon of the Old Testament, and probably the Eastern Orthodox, I'm guessing, the writer Judith sort of twists what Isaiah says in Isaiah 66:24. Recall, Isaiah 66:24 has God's enemies having been slain, and their corpses are being they're being exposed to the righteous. And the text says that their worm will not die, and the fire will not be quenched. And this is the language of decomposing agents. Fire that isn't quenched throughout Scripture is fire that won't be stopped from fully consuming its fuel. And a worm that does not die is a worm that doesn't die in the process of what its purpose is. It's what it's doing, which is it's a maggot. It's consuming corpses. And that's why in that passage I mentioned earlier, Jeremiah 7, God says that you won't be able to frighten away the beasts and the birds that scavenge upon the corpses of God's enemies. It's an image communicating that they will complete their meal, as morbid as that sounds. But Judith sort of flips it on its head, and he says that worms and fire will eat at the conscious living enemies of God, and they will weep and gnash forever, or they will experience some kind of agony for all eternity. So you do have that example of, seemingly anyway, of eternal torment in the intertestamental period. But there doesn't seem to be much else, at least in favor of eternal torment, not so far as I can tell. On the other hand, we do have texts like, I'm pulling it up here, we do have texts like the Targums. Actually, let's go with the Dead Sea Scrolls. We'll start with that. So there's dealing with the Dead Sea Scrolls is a little bit difficult because we don't, for the most part, have handy-dandy names for them, like the Book of Judith. Instead, very often what we have are a numbered scroll and then a reference to some chapter and verse in the scroll. And I'm looking here at First Qumran Scroll 4, verses 12 to 14, and at first glance, it sounds like it's talking about eternal torment. It references afflictions, eternal damnation, permanent terror and shame without end, the fire of the dark regions, bitter weeping. But then the text goes on to say, until their destruction, without there being a remnant or survivor. And that word destruction in the Hebrew is kala and means complete destruction. It's even defined as annihilation in certain lexicons. First Qumran Scroll 2, 6 to 8 and 15 says, may God bring upon you destruction. You'll be sentenced to the gloom of everlasting fire, which sounds a lot like eternal torment. But it says that fire will consume the wicked for everlasting destruction. And again, this word for destruction is that word meaning obliteration, annihilation. So we've got the Dead Sea Scrolls, and it's pretty clear that the writers of the Dead Sea Scrolls were annihilationists. But that's not all, and I'll make the rest brief. We do have material that was compiled after the time of Christ, but which is believed to contain at least some amount of data that stretches back into the time before Christ. One example is what's called the Targums. The Targums they're like the Septuagint. If your viewers are familiar with the Septuagint, it was a Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament produced in the time leading up to Christ. And when you read quotes from the Old Testament in the New Testament, you're very often reading quotes from the Septuagint. Well, the Targums are like that, but into Aramaic. So the Targums take the Old Testament and translate it into Aramaic and then add some commentary and midrash and stuff. And in the Targums, this is fascinating, you find the phrase second death and the word Gehenna used in close proximity to each other in a number of places. And everywhere that happens, everywhere either of those things are mentioned, the picture is of God's enemies being killed in Gehenna and not participating in the life to come. So the Targums, which are the earliest compilations we have of them, are from after year 0, but to the extent that they reflect the thinking of the Jewish people between the Testaments, as it's thought to some degree, there we're seeing annihilationism. And then one last example is the rabbinic literature. So when I talk about the rabbinic literature, I'm talking here about the Tosefta, the Mishnah, and the Talmud. And these are all bodies of rabbinic literature that were compiled after the time of Christ, but once again are believed to reflect the rabbinical views from between the Testaments that were then inherited by the Pharisees, about whom we read in the New Testament. And what we see there is language like in the Mishnah. Eduyot says that the judgment of the wicked in Gehenna is 12 months, not everlasting. That's not to say, however, that their judgment will result in their salvation. No, it says, Mishnah Sanhedrin says that they will have no portion in the world to come. They're not destined to rise up in the world to come. The Talmud, the Jerusalem Talmud in Sanhedrin, says that the wicked in Gehenna will be judged for 12 months, and then they won't receive a portion in the world to come. It's not possible. And then there's one more here, and this is really fascinating. The Tosefta, Sanhedrin, says the wicked will go down to Gehenna and are judged there for 12 months. After those 12 months, their souls perish and their bodies are burned. Gehenna absorbs them, and they are turned to dirt. So the rabbinic literature, to the extent that it reflects what was believed between the Testaments by the Jews, again, testifies to a fairly widespread belief in annihilationism. So just to summarize all of that data, what we see in the intertestamental period is not a lot about final punishment explicitly, but what we do find is a little bit in favor of eternal torment, and then a lot, especially among the Dead Sea Scrolls, in favor of annihilation, which also finds support in the rabbinical and Talmud literature compiled shortly after the time of Christ, but thought to reflect the beliefs, at least to some extent, of the Jews between the Testaments. The case seems pretty strong that the widespread Jewish belief was in annihilation rather than eternal torment. Sorry, that was really long-winded, but as you said, it's an extensive question.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate that. So I love the extra biblical topics here. So off the cuff question, when you say that, there's a lot of these texts that seem to prefer annihilationism, and then you have only a few that seem to point to eternal conscious torment, but some of those annihilationist texts appear to look like they're eternal conscious torment until you read further. Do you think it's possible at all that these texts that are talking about eternal conscious torment just haven't fully fleshed their view, and maybe they are actually annihilationists, but they're only talking about specific parts of the process? Does that make any sense?
It makes sense, and I think you're probably right. I think this is a topic that merits a closer look by people on all sides of this hell debate. And it's not just the explanation you offered that could account for what appear to be eternal torment texts actually being written by people who believed in annihilationism. There's at least two other possible scenarios that would support that. One is perhaps we've mistranslated or misunderstood what the author was saying. So in the case of Judith, for example, there's an annihilationist scholar named David Instone Brewer, who is an expert in rabbinics, intertestamental rabbinics in the time of Jesus as well. And he argues that what Judith is saying when he writes that worms and fire will eat at these wicked, and they will weep and experience, whatever forever. He thinks that that's not translated correctly, and that it is talking about some kind of torment, but one that culminates in destruction in the sense that I mean it. So it's possible then that Judith and some other books, very few of them that seem to support eternal torment, could be just translated wrong and deserve a closer look. But there's a third possibility that I think applies especially to a book like First Enoch. But First Enoch is thought to reflect belief in eternal torment as well. But First Enoch is extremely apocalyptic, as far as I can tell. And what I mean by that is that the writer or writers of First Enoch are recording ostensibly divine visions of the future. And all throughout Scripture, prophetic visions of the future are not straightforward depictions of the future. They use symbols to symbolize what will happen in the future. And as we will probably talk about in the course of our conversation, I think that the book of Revelation, which falls into that category, actually teaches my view pretty clearly, even though it sounds like it's talking about eternal torment in places. And if I'm right about that, then that could also very well be the case with a book like First Enoch. So the point is, yes, you're absolutely right. I think as scholars specifically interested in this debate pore over more deeply into the intertestamental literature, I think we might find that writings that once were thought to teach eternal torment, in fact, teach annihilation.
And as we will quickly know that, this is a very complicated topic.
It is.
All right, so let's talk about the New Testament. What do you think are the typical views? How do they describe hell in the New Testament?
Well, it depends on what question you're asking when you're looking at the text. So Paul, for example, you won't find any references to hell directly in any of his writings. What you do find, however, is his seeming belief that only the righteous, only the saved, will be raised immortal. So in 1 Corinthians 15, for example, he says that the dead will rise, first Jesus, then those who are his at his coming. That's Christians. And he says that when the dead are raised, this mortal will put on immortality, because immortality is needed to inherit the kingdom of God. Now, this isn't to say that Paul doesn't believe the lost will rise. He explicitly says as much in the book of Acts. He says that there will be a resurrection of both the just and the unjust. However, he appears to believe that only the saved will be raised immortal, leaving the lost to be raised still mortal. And then he also talks about how the wages of sin is death. And before some of your viewers say, oh, well, by death he means spiritual death or something like that. Well, no. A mere verse or two, and there weren't verse or chapter divisions in the originals. Just a couple verses after saying the wages of sin is death in Romans 6:23, Paul says at the beginning of Romans chapter 7 that when a spouse dies, his wife, his still living wife, is free to remarry. So in the very breath with which Paul says the wages of sin is death, but the free gift of God is eternal life in Christ Jesus, he says death frees a still living spouse to remarry. So what does he mean by death? He means death. So Paul, if you and you've got 2 Thessalonians 1:8-9, where he talks about God coming in flaming and fire and inflicting vengeance, language which comes from Isaiah 66:15. that scene in which God's enemies are slain and their corpses are burned up and eaten up by maggots. He says, he appeals to that, and he says that the punishment of the wicked will be everlasting destruction from the presence of the Lord. So Paul seems to think that only the righteous will be raised immortal. He seems to think that the wages of sin is actually dying and not some kind of spiritual death in never dying bodies. And he seems to think that the punishment is everlasting destruction, in the sense that we see in Isaiah 66, God's enemies being slain and dead and remained dead forever, eaten up by fire and maggots. If we ask Jude and Peter what their view of hell is, again, they don't talk about hell directly, explicitly, the way that Jesus does. But they both do point to what happened to Sodom and Gomorrah in Genesis 19 as an illustration or an example of what awaits the ungodly. Peter is particularly explicit and says that by reducing those cities to ashes, God condemned them to extinction, making them an example of what awaits the ungodly. So if you were to ask Jude and Peter, hey, what do you think hell will be like? They'll say, if you want to know what hell will be like, look at what happened to the people who lived in Sodom and Gomorrah, which sounds an awful lot like my view. If you were to ask Jesus in the Gospels, now we get to somebody who actually talks explicitly and even names hell as Gehenna. Again, a wordplay pointing back to what was associated with the Valley of the Sons of Hinnom. And Jesus says things like in Gehenna, he says in Matthew 10:28, don't fear human beings who can only kill your body but can't kill your soul. Rather, fear the one, and it's pretty clearly God he's referring to, who can destroy both body and soul in Gehenna, in hell. And what's interesting here is that the word translated destroy, apollumi in Greek, when it's used in the way Jesus uses it here, namely in what grammarians call the active voice, transitively, to describe what one person does to another. Everywhere in the Gospels, the Synoptic Gospels, apollumi means slay or kill. Herod, for example, wanted to slay apollumi, the baby Jesus, and trust me, Herod didn't just want to separate the baby Jesus or ruin him or waste him. He wanted to kill that child. And so Jesus here says, fear God because he can do what men can't. Men can kill your body, but they can't kill your soul. God can kill both. And then, of course, we can ask ourselves, in hell, by the way, he can kill both in hell. Now, we can, of course, say, does that mean he will, the fact that he can? But I think that's a pretty silly question, because the parallel in Luke has Jesus saying, fear the one who can, don't fear men who can kill you but can't do anything more with you. Fear God who can kill you and then throw you into Gehenna. And so both throw you into Gehenna and kill your body and soul in Gehenna, both capture the gist of what Jesus says there. And we have lots of texts in Jesus's lips in which he says the wicked will be cast into Gehenna. So yeah, God will destroy both body and soul in Gehenna. He also says that in Matthew 13 that the wicked will be like chaff that is burned up in a fire. So he has this parable early in Matthew 13 where the righteous are like wheat and the unrighteous are like weeds or tares, and in the parable the two kinds of vegetable are separated, and the weeds, the tares, are thrown into a fire and burned up. The Greek word katakaio, not meaning just to burn, but to burn up, to consume. And then he interprets the parable a little bit later in Matthew 13 to say, so will the Son of Man throw all evildoers and lawbreakers into a furnace of fire. Again, the picture is of them being burned up. But he does also go on to say there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth there. But this is stock language of anger and sadness that appears very much to be something that the wicked experience when they realize they're being excluded from the kingdom of God. But it doesn't say that weeping and gnashing will go on forever, and we would expect somebody to weep and gnash as they're being burned to death. Doesn't mean that they remain alive forever. There are other examples in John 3, 15 and 16. I think it's John who probably says that God so loved the world that he gave his only son, that whoever believes in him will not perish, but have everlasting life. But in the immediately preceding verse, Jesus he offers himself as the antitype to the type of the that is Moses's bronze statue of a serpent. And when the Israelites were bitten by otherwise fatally venomous snakes, they could look at that statue and literally have their lives saved. And that's what John says Jesus is. He's literally a lifesaver. And I could go on. The one other area that might be worth looking at is the book of Revelation, but that's typically thought to be a challenge to my view. So before I get into that, I'll wait until you bring it up. So yeah, that's in short, what we see in the New Testament is very consistent with what we see in the Old Testament and the intertestamental literature. The fate of the wicked isn't immortality and living forever in hell. It's rising to face God's terrible, terrifying judgment and be found guilty of sin that merits death, and they will be killed, never to live or experience anything ever again. That's the message of the New Testament.
Yeah, it's really fascinating that, a lot of us specifically watching, I know me for sure, like, growing up, we had the specific view of hell, and then what typically happens is you read the Bible through a specific lens, and, everything else becomes like some kind of metaphor, or, you don't need to take that literally, just these other hell passages here. So it's interesting to talk about this. Question for you. So do you see a difference between the Sheol, Gehenna, Lake of Fire? I know there's Hades. Do you see a difference between any of those?
Yeah, so Sheol is the Hebrew word used throughout the Old Testament for the grave, for the pit, for the world of the dead. Whether or not people are conscious there is another debate. And the New Testament Greek counterpart to the Hebrew Sheol is the Greek Hades, which we pronounce Hades as English speakers. So Sheol, Sheol and Hades, these are references to the place of the dead. It's the intermediate state is what theologians call it. And they call it that because it's intermediate. It's between death and resurrection. And there's also Tartarus, by the way. Tartarus isn't named in the New Testament, but there is a verb that Peter uses, tartarao, which means to cast into Tartarus. And what he says, and the way he uses that is similar to Sheol and Hades, except for fallen angelic beings. So it's sort of like the intermediate state, the place where some demons evidently are held awaiting their final judgment, which appears to be annihilation as well. So Sheol, Hades, and Tartarus are all sort of intermediate states. The first two for humans, the third for angelic beings. When we get to actual hell, and by hell here I mean the place of final punishment, where the resurrected lost and where demons are finally judged, that appears to be what Jesus is referring to when he uses the word Gehenna. Again, it's a play on words, that Valley of the Son of Hinnom. And that also appears to be what the lake of fire is in the apocalyptic vision that John sees and records in the book of Revelation. And that's why he says that death and Hades, after they give up their dead when they are raised, death and Hades will be thrown into the lake of fire. There will no longer after that be an intermediate state or a place where the dead go to await resurrection, because after the wicked are destroyed in hell, symbolized by the lake of fire, they will never rise again. There will be no waiting place. So yeah, hopefully that answers your question. Again, Sheol, Hades, and Tartarus are kind of like the intermediate state. Gehenna and the lake of fire are the place of final punishment, what I think most of us refer to by hell.
Very, very interesting. Okay, I like that nuance there. So yeah, go ahead and get into, you had you mentioned some texts in Revelation that seem to point to, eternal conscious torment, but which obviously contradicts your view of, final judgment of annihilationism. So can you talk about those passages?
Yeah, and before I do, it's really important that I reiterate what I said earlier. Prophetic visions in Scripture, visions of the future, are not literally depicting the future. They put a bunch of bizarre symbols together to foretell the future, and they're so bizarre that they very often require interpretation on the part of somebody who is gifted with the ability to interpret them. So, for example, Joseph, with his multicolored coat that his father gave him, when he's in prison after he is sent there by Potiphar, whose wife lied about him. While Joseph is in prison, he interprets the prophetic visions of the Pharaoh's cupbearer and his baker. And these dreams, these visions are filled with bizarre symbols. But when Joseph interprets those symbols of baskets of bread on the baker's head and a branch with 3 blossoms in the cupbearer's dream, he says he tells us what those symbols mean. He tells them both that those 3 baskets and those 3 blossoms on the branch are 3 days, meaning they symbolize 3 days, after which both of those 2 officials would meet their fate. And then in the next chapter, he does the same thing with Pharaoh. Pharaoh has this bizarre dream in which 7 healthy cows come up out of the Nile. And while they're grazing, 7 sickly cows come up out of the Nile after them and eat the first 7. But what Joseph tells Pharaoh is that has nothing to do with healthy and sick cows at all, or the Nile. What it has to do with is there will be 7 years of abundance and plenitude, followed by 7 years of famine. And you see this happening in the book of Daniel. Nebuchadnezzar has a dream with a motley statue comprised of multiple parts. But Daniel interprets Nebuchadnezzar's dream as symbolizing a series of successive kingdoms. Daniel has a dream with multiple beasts that is interpreted to mean the same thing. And this is the way that prophetic visions work all throughout Scripture. So what John sees when he's in exile on the island of Patmos, what he sees in Revelation 14, chapter 14, verses 9 through 11, is he sees an angel flying and saying, after a beast has been introduced, so this is all part of the vision, the angel says that, here, I'm going to bring it up. I've forgotten the exact wording, and I want to be precise. So this angel says, anyone who worships the beast and its image receives a mark on his forehead or on his hand. He will also drink the wine of God's wrath, poured full strength into the cup of his anger, and he will be tormented with fire and sulfur in the presence of the holy angels and in the presence of the Lamb. And the smoke of their torment goes up forever and ever, and they have no rest day or night. So you can see the picture, and you can see why it sounds to people like eternal torment, because it is eternal torment in the vision. The beast is this 7-headed, 10-horned beast in the vision, symbolizing a kingdom with successive kings, as we read about in chapter 17. And what the symbolism is depicting is the beast worshippers sharing in the same fate as the beast. And that fate is everlasting torment by fire, so everlasting that smoke will rise from it forever and ever, and these people being burned in fire, tormented there, will not have rest day or night. But the question isn't what does that imagery depict, the question is what does that imagery symbolize? And as it turns out, Revelation answers that question for us. Because if we just go a few chapters later, in Revelation chapter 18, we see all 3 of those same images: drinking wine, the wine of God's wrath, torment and fire and sulfur, and smoke rising from torment forever. We see all 3 of those things. In Revelation chapter 18, there's this harlot, Mystery Babylon, and she is made to drink of God's wrath at the hands of God's people in Revelation 18:6. She is tormented in fire, and so, at least fire, if not also sulfur, in places like verses 9 and there are others here, 15, or the fear of her torment. So we've got tormented fire and burning, we've got drinking God's wrath, and then at the beginning of Revelation chapter 19, a chorus cries out, "Hallelujah, the smoke from her goes up forever and ever." So all 3 of those symbols converge. But what does it symbolize? Well, in Revelation 18:19, an angel in verse 21 takes up a great millstone and throws it into the sea and says, "So will Babylon, the great city that is represented by that harlot, will be thrown down with violence and will be found no more." In fact, that phrase, "no more," is repeated over and over and over and over and over again in the verses that follow. So all of those symbols that depict eternal torment are expressly interpreted as symbolizing the destruction of the city that the harlot represents. And for that reason, I think we're kind of obligated to see the same in Revelation 14. Otherwise, we're just picking and choosing what we want to allow. We're just picking and choosing when to apply the imagery in the way that the book does, and when we want to apply it the way that we want to. Now, the other verse or passage in Revelation that is often thought to support eternal torment is Revelation 20:10-15. In Revelation 20:10, the devil is seen, John sees the devil, and actually what he sees is a dragon symbolizing the devil. But he sees him thrown into the lake of fire where the beast and the false prophet had been thrown earlier in his vision. And it says they will be tormented day and night forever and ever. And then a few verses later, death and Hades give up the dead, as I mentioned, and the dead who are not found in the Lamb's Book of Life are also thrown into the lake of fire. So it stands to reason that they share the same fate as the devil, the beast, and the false prophet do, torment forever and ever in this lake of fire. But here's the thing. I haven't yet exhausted the identities of those who are thrown into the lake of fire. Death and Hades in verse 14 of Revelation 20 are thrown into the lake of fire as well. Now this is important because in John's vision, death and Hades are every bit as much conscious entities as the devil, the beast, and the false prophet and resurrected humanity. Back in chapter 6, they're the fourth horseman of the apocalypse. Death, John sees death on a pale horse, and following death is Hades, kind of like death's squire. So then what does it mean for these horsemen after they give up their dead? These horsemen are then thrown into the lake of fire. What does that symbolize? Well, look what it says just a few verses later in Revelation 21:4. God will wipe away every tear from their eyes, and death shall be no more. See, it's this picture of death and Hades being thrown into the lake of fire is a symbol for the annihilation of death, of the reality of death, and of a holding place for the dead while awaiting resurrection. And it's not only John who does that. Paul does it in 1 Corinthians 15 as well, saying that when the righteous are raised immortal, death will be the last enemy to be destroyed. And both of them are trading on Isaiah 25, in which Yahweh promises one day to swallow up death forever. So the symbolism of death and Hades, these horsemen being thrown into the lake of fire, is symbolism for the annihilation of the realities that they represent. So that's one reason to think that that's probably the case with everything thrown into the lake of fire. But there's one other thing I'll add, and then I'll turn things back over to you. Remember a couple of things. Remember that I said the phrase second death and Gehenna appear together in the Aramaic Targums, where they symbolize, or where they're used to express the reality that God's enemies will finally be slain in Gehenna. Well, John uses the phrase second death in Revelation 20:14 and in a couple of other places. We don't find the language of second death anywhere else in the intertestamental literature except for the Targums. So that's a good reason for thinking that John is pointing his readers to the Aramaic Targums they may have been familiar with. But then also, remember I said that when Joseph interprets Pharaoh's dreams, he says the 7 cows are 7 years. He tells the baker that the 3 baskets are 3 days. Notice the way that construction works. Image is, or symbol is reality. The symbol symbolizes the reality. So when John says in Revelation 20:14 that the lake of fire is the second death, which is also what God says in Revelation 21:8, what that means is the thing that John sees in the image is the symbol, but what does it symbolize? Dying a second time. See, what traditionalists tend to want to do, people who believe in eternal torment, is switch that on its head. The thing that the thing that needs explaining is the second death. And the way you explain what that is you point to the eternal torment in the vision. But that's exactly the opposite of how this works. The thing that's seen in the vision is eternal torment in a lake of fire. How is it explained? What is its interpretation in reality? The second death, dying a second time, just like it appears to be used to mean in the Targums. So the point of all of this is just to say, and there's more, by the way, that I could say about both of these passages, but the point is that here again is a case where at first glance, it looks like, especially to people convinced of eternal torment, that these passages are teaching it. But when you do just a little bit of digging and apply sound principles of hermeneutics, what you discover is that these passages actually positively teach my view and challenge the doctrine of eternal torment, and for that matter, universalism. So, and I'll just add one last thing. That is what convinced me of this view more than anything else about 10 years ago or so, is that with virtually no exception, every proof text historically cited in support of eternal torment proves upon closer examination to teach eternal torment or conditional immortality. Sorry, annihilation or conditional immortality. So, sorry, that was another long-winded answer.
Yeah, go for it. No, that's awesome. I appreciate that. So, it's interesting. A lot of these discussions you have, something like a Calvinism Arminianism debate. You have certain proof texts here, certain proof texts here, and one of them seem to be better justification than the other, and then some other texts seem to be better justification than other texts. And then what happens oftentimes is like, oh, that's symbolic, or that's not literal, or whatever. You kind of have to like, do some type of changing into like what we basically see as the text. But it seems like in your view, like, it's it seems maybe not on face value, but when you dig further, it seems to be like a lot of these texts that are typically eternal conscious torment don't actually end up being that, and that's really fascinating to me, at least. So go ahead and just give your case for what you think the different views the early church fathers took.
Yeah, so here's how I would characterize the historical development, and then I'll give you a few examples. It appears to me, somebody who is not a historical theologian, so you've got to take what I say here with a grain of salt, but it appears to me as if the earliest church fathers all teach, if they teach anything about final punishment or about hell, they teach my view, annihilationism or conditional immortality. And then in the latter half of the 2nd century, so between 150 to 200 AD, you start to find the other two views, universalism and eternal torment. And then, and all three views from that point until not long after Augustine, all three of those views mixed happily. You didn't see Christians condemning each other or anathematizing each other. You won't find in the ecumenical creeds like Nicaea and Chalcedon, you won't see affirmations of any particular view of hell. So these three views, first my view, conditionalism, and then eternal torment and universalism, they exist in harmony with each other inside the church. And then Augustine comes along and he puts his stamp of approval on the doctrine of eternal torment. And Augustine was brilliant. He's a genius. I think he deserves a lot of the esteem in which he is held by Christians. But I think he was wrong about hell. But his influence meant that when he put his stamp of approval on the doctrine of eternal torment, it became quickly the dominant view and has remained the dominant view since. So what would I say to... as evidence for the historical development that I just proposed? Well, the earliest writings we have are Clement of Rome is a good example. Clement of Rome is writing at around 95 AD. So depending upon how you date the book of Revelation, he's living in the very time in which the canon is still being completed. Now, I've taken early date for Revelation, so that's not me. But anyway, very early. And what Clement of Rome says in 95 AD, roughly, is that life and immortality are the gifts of God, and that righteous conduct is the gate of righteousness, which is set open for the attainment of life. And the word for life there, and the word live, zoe and zao, that language is used throughout Clement for just ordinary physical life and living. Ignatius of Antioch is writing right around the same time, maybe a few years later, 100 AD roughly. And he says that the reason the Lord suffered the death that he did was so that he might breathe immortality into his church. Not all of humankind. In fact, he says, were he to reward us to our works, we would cease to be. So two writers writing around the turn of the 1st century both seem to share my view. And that continues even into the 2nd and even late century. So Irenaeus of Lyon, the writer of Against Heresies, he says that the one who rejects God's gift of eternal life deprives himself of continuance forever and ever, and will not receive from him length of days forever and ever. And there are other examples I could provide, the Didache, the Epistle of Barnabas, and there are others. But then we get, right around that same time Irenaeus is writing, we get to the first two traditionalist writers I can find. Tatian of Adiabene is writing in around 160 AD, and he says that after we die, we will receive either the immortality with enjoyment or the immortality with pain. Athenagoras of Athens, writing right around the same time, says that everybody's going to live another life, either better than the present one or a worse one and in fire, for God has not made us to be annihilated. So we can see that the earliest church fathers in the first century and into the second are evidently, as far as I can tell, teaching my view. Then eternal torment crops up in the likes of Athenagoras and Tatian. And I think that part of the reason we see it start to crop up is because we're starting to see more and more converts to Christianity from pagan worldviews that affirmed the immortality of the soul, like Platonism and Manichaeism. And in fact, you'll find in the writings of some of these traditionalist church fathers appeals to Plato in support of their view. But it's not just eternal torment at that time. We also find in that same time frame, toward the end of the 200s, you find the writings of Universalists, Alexandria of Athens and Origen of Athens, or Alexandria. Sorry, Origen and Origen and Alexandria? No, they're both from Alexandria, and I just said it. Anyway, there are these two writers, for some reason, Clement of Alexandria, sorry. Clement of Alexandria and Origen of Alexandria. You find them writing at around the turn of the 2nd century, and they are teaching universalism. What I can't find prior to about 150 AD are any Christian writings in favor of either eternal torment or universalism. I only find conditionalists. And there's a plausible explanation for why the other two views would crop up in church history. And that explanation that I've offered is that converts are coming from Platonic or Manichaean worldviews that affirm the immortality of the soul, and they read that in unknowingly to themselves. They read that into the text, and so they come away thinking eternal torment or universalism. And then the history unfolds from there. But I'm not a historian. I would like to see more church historians dig into this with a view toward, with a mind and eye open to finding texts that might have been misunderstood in past times as teaching eternal torment, when upon closer inspection they may in fact teach my view.
That is really, really fascinating. Okay, so something that you briefly talked about. Last question here. You focused more about, like, do we last eternally, or is hell eternal, or is hell just have like kind of like a final point, where people die? When you didn't spend a ton of time talking about like whether hell is like literal fire or metaphorical. Like, in your eyes, is there any truth to the idea that there's going to be like a literal fire in hell?
I think so, and I'll offer that evidence in a moment. But I want to emphasize that it's disputable, and I think it's a respectable view to hold on either side of that question. But I do lean toward thinking there will actually be the wicked will actually be killed by fire, and the reason I lean toward that is because Jude says, as I mentioned earlier, he offers the inhabitants of Sodom and Gomorrah and what befell them in Genesis 19 as an illustration or as an example of what awaits the ungodly. And the word that he uses is daigma in Greek, which is a pretty strong word for example. Can it be a loose example such that a fiery execution could be exemplary of simply people dying because God passively unplugs them from the source of life or something like that? Maybe, but the word daigma is a pretty strong word for that kind of loose example. It's more often seemingly a much more strict or literal example. It's for example, if I were to hand you an apple, I might say this is an example of fruit. Well, it's more like instance of fruit, right? It's stronger than merely example. And in the same way, that seems to suggest to me, especially given the abundance of biblical expressions that associate final destruction with fire, it's enough for me to think, yeah, they probably will be burned up, killed and destroyed that way. But I hold it out loosely. It's not something I think worth being dogmatic over. What I will say, though, is that the arguments against literal fire are often pretty weak. The most common argument is that you have conflicting metaphors in Scripture, light, fire, which produces light, versus darkness, which can't coexist. Well, first of all, it is possible for a flame to burn and produce no light. But second, and more importantly, the Bible doesn't, in fact, use those conflicting metaphors. When Jesus, for example, speaks about weeping and gnashing of teeth in outer darkness is not a metaphor for hell. It's a description of a location within the scene of his parables. The righteous in his parables are inside a wedding hall enjoying a banquet, and the wicked are thrown out into the outer darkness, the darkness outside. It's a first century historical scene in which people are bound hand and foot and thrown into the dark, cold wilderness, where they'll either be killed by beasts or by robbers or by exposure to the elements. So outer darkness is not a metaphor for hell. When Jude sometimes uses outer darkness as a metaphor, but not for hell specifically, more for just being gone. Anyway, the point is, it doesn't seem to me that the argument against literal fire and hell is very good. But I would say that the argument for literal fire and hell also isn't all that great. And I think whatever side we fall on, we should do so with a great big grain of salt. Yeah.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I a lot of times in these discussions, I hear like, all right, so you grow up on a certain view of hell, and like you almost throw the baby out with the bathwater, where like we're going to a different view, and that also means that the fire can't be literal either. So that's really interesting. I didn't actually know your view on that before talking about this. So that's really cool to think about. Okay, yeah. So any last thoughts before you end, and where can we reach you at if we want to learn more about your views?
Well, as far as a parting word or a final thought, I'll say this. My goal in my ministry on this topic, and especially here in an interview like this one, is not to persuade viewers of my view. I'd love for them to accept what I'm saying because I think it's biblical, but that's not really my overriding goal. My chief goal in stuff like this is to show people who believe in eternal torment that somebody can differ, somebody can disagree, and have good reasons for doing so, and be committed to the authority of Scripture and be completely orthodox in every way. There's no good reason for the church to divide over this topic. There's no good reason for churches to kick people out if they don't believe in eternal torment, as has happened to my best friend. There's no good reason for churches to refuse to let people teach if they believe in an alternative to eternal torment. There's no good reason for seminaries to fire professors or to refuse to hire professors who don't hold to eternal torment. There's no good reason for seminaries to refuse admittance to prospective students if they don't hold to eternal torment, as has happened to me. There's just no reason for this kind of for the kind of hate and heresy hunting that so often happens in the context of this debate. If everybody watching this came away still believing in eternal torment, but being willing to see that I'm a brother that should be fellowshipped with, even in the local church context, and they say, yeah, I can understand why I don't agree with you, Chris, but I see why you believe it, that would be a win for me. And so my plea to your viewers is, let's treat this as the important issue that it is, but not one that is worth dividing over, because it's not. And what happens when we divide over it and when we claw at each other and tear at each other's throats, what happens is we are then less capable of effectively carrying out the mission that we have as God's people to take a life-saving gospel to a world that desperately needs it. And so that's what I hope people will take away, is realize people who don't hold to eternal torment may have really good reasons for doing so and may be every bit as orthodox and committed to Scripture as you. Now, as for resources, first of all, the one-stop shop for everything I do, not only on hell but on other things, is my website, chrisdate.info. I also am part of the ministry Rethinking Hell, which people can find at rethinkinghell.com. We do have a YouTube channel. It's youtube.com/rethinkinghell. We have a variety of things there. We've got what is currently on pause, but has been a bi-weekly live stream. It's also got a variety of pre-recorded videos we've done, conference presentations that we've had recorded at our conferences. A lot of stuff there that's useful. And then I also have my own personal YouTube channel, which also is on pause right now because my family is going through a bit of a health crisis at the moment. But that I cover a variety of topics on that channel, and people can find it at youtube.com/theopologetics. That's the word apologetics, but without the A, lopped onto the end of theo from theology. So theopologetics. And I cover a variety of topics there. So if they just remember those three things, chrisdate.info, rethinkinghell.com, and theopologetics, they'll easily be able to find more. And I'm also pretty accessible. So if anybody wants to email me with questions, email me at chrisdate@rethinkinghell.com, or just send me a friend request on Facebook and shoot me a message letting me know that you heard about me from this interview, and we'll talk further.
Awesome. All right. Much appreciated, Chris. I hope you have a great rest of your day.
You as well. Thank you.